All right, so I'm starting an in-depth study on the Gospel of John, and I am reading a giant seminary book, so you don't have to. And I'll be reading this, and yeah, I'll be summarizing it for you so you can kind of listen to my discoveries on your way home to work or whatever, and hopefully this will be interesting for you. But what I want to do is start out with kind of the context. And I want to start with go way back to the Jewish culture. And I would submit to you that the most interesting thing about the Jewish culture, probably over and above all the dominance that it's had or influence that it's had on Western culture, is that it's still around today. And it's still around in the basic identity that it's had ever since it began, or the first records that we have of it back in 1000 BC. And the reason I say that is because, dude, Israel was one of the smallest kingdoms there was back then. It was basically a very insignificant culture. When you think about it, I mean, compared to Assyria, compared to Babylon, Sumeria, these giant names, Egypt, Persia. Now, like Egypt and Persia, okay, they exist in countries today, but the identity that they have now is far different than the dominance that they had before, in a sense. And of course, Babylon, Sumeria, none of these kingdoms really survived, even though they were huge, sprawling empires. And so you think, well, why did Judaism persist? Why did their identity remain intact? Because, in fact, like, Israel was tiny, right, compared to the sprawling empires that were surrounding it. And not only that, but they had divisions. And so their kingdom got divided into north and south. And so now they're even smaller. And somewhere around 700 BC, Assyria came in and completely annihilated the northern kingdom. They smashed them. And then a couple hundred years later, Babylon smashed the southern kingdom. So they got conquested, and then, usually you kind of know the drill back in the day. If there's two warring nations, what do? They, in ancient history, they both pray to their gods, and they say, well, my God will kill your God, like my dad will kill your dad, or will beat up your dad. And they would just go to war. And then whoever won, it was sort of the unspoken rule that God was superior, was a true God, and you kind of had to take your idols down and hang them up, and you eventually got absorbed into that dominant culture, and your identity was annihilated, basically. It was just gone, and no one ever remembered you again. You just became an Assyrian or whatever. But for the Israelites, that did not happen. Their culture persisted. No matter how much bloodshed, warfare, conquest, subjugation, it didn't matter. Their identity remained intact. And I've been listening to these lectures from this woman named Christine Hayes from Yale University. I don't know if she's teaching anymore, but these lectures are from 11 years ago. And she said the Israelites, above all, were a people with an idea. That their idea was so radical and revolutionary from the prevailing thought of the time that it allowed them to persist through all those conquests, even until the modern age, and not just persist, but lay the groundwork for entire civilizations, modern civilizations of today. And she's like, what was this idea? It's really interesting. The idea basically was monotheism. And it was a monotheism in the context of a polytheistic culture. And usually you think, okay, monotheism, okay, whatever, it's just one God versus 10. What's the difference? It was so much more than that. It was an absolute repudiation of how most cultures saw the universe, their theory on reality. They absolutely 100% rejected those theories and came up with a completely different configuration of how they saw the world, of how the world was. She even went so far as to call it a polemic against the prevailing thought of the time. Now, what's really interesting, too, is like, if someone comes up with a different religion, we just think, oh, yeah, just a new form of thought, and we still go shop at Whole Foods, and, our lives don't really change. But back then, the Hebrews, they didn't even have a word for religion. That's how dominant religion was back then. Because you can think about it like this. Like, if you're a fish and you're in the deep sea and you don't know that there's a surface to the water, do you even know what water is? You are just like, that's all you know. You don't know that you're in water if you've never seen the surface of the water. And that's kind of like what religion was to them back then. They didn't have a word for it. It just was. So for them to come up with an entirely, like, a hard break from the thought of the time was like a complete rejection of everything that they knew, and they formed it into this new idea. So okay, let's think about that. Why is monotheism so different than polytheism? Basically, with polytheism, what they have, right, you have these gods emerging from some kind of divine substance. So in the Sumerian culture, for example, I mean, sure, you started out with two gods, but they were basically freshwater and saltwater, the Apsu and then Tiamat. And these gods, they were vulnerable. So they gave birth to these lesser gods, their kids, and eventually their kids ganged up on them and killed them. So like they murdered the Apsu, and they made the Apsu into their home. But just to say, like, and then they had their own intrigues, and like these gods were born, and they were as subject to the randomness and coincidences and catastrophes of time that we are. They're kind of like humans on a higher octave. And the idea is that, like, the universe itself is full of this divine substance. It's sort of like this, almost like the Force, and it spawns these gods, and these gods are subject to the, I guess, the nature or the rules of this divine substance. So they're kind of like humans. And that's sort of where mythologies spawn, where you get the life of these gods, and they're very life-like. I mean, they're very human-like. There's a scene in the Iliad that I'm reading where Hera puts oil on her skin, and she braids her hair, and she puts on a nice dress and jewelry, and she goes and talks to Zeus, right? They're very human-like. In the Sumerian literatures, they drink beer through a straw. Usually most of their decisions follows a round of beers for some reason. And they have butter cake. And so, right, they're very human. And then this divine substance also creates nature. And that's why you have, like, nature worship. So some gods are like rivers, or rivers are like the gods, and the storm is because of a god, and trees. And so you have this sort of worldview where there's sort of this magical nature to the world, but everyone is kind of, no one really knows what's going on, right? The gods know more, but they can get backstabbed by other gods, and that's how the universe is. And not only that, but the universe spawns, like, good gods and bad gods. So there's good and evil, and both of these forces, good and evil, are existent on their own. They're metaphysical realities, and they clash. And there's no real prevailing morality that that dominates one side or another. It's good and evil, and you can, it sort of doesn't matter. And so I guess that's kind of why, like, so then when you go to war and your god loses, then it must just mean that another god came and destroyed that god, because that's how the universe works. Sometimes gods live, they're born, they get killed. Sometimes they rise from the dead, right? And that was the prevailing way they saw reality. And now the Jews come with this monotheism. And so what's the difference? Well, the difference is that there's one God, and this one God is the divine substance. That he is the source of everything. And so he, by definition then, he is preeminent, right? His will is uncontested. He is eternal. He simply is. There's no story of his birth or his death. He simply just is, right? And he's omniscient, which means that he's not subject to the randomness and catastrophes of time. No one gets the better of him. No one sneaks up on him. He knows all things, so he's in control of history and time, and that he is inherently good. And that is kind of one of the most surprising things about this monotheism that the Jews came up with, was that they thought that the universe was then inherently good, that the essential nature of all things is good. The force of good is the essence of reality, and that evil is simply a perversion of good. Evil is evil was created good, and then you can choose against good. And so it is no match for the all-knowing, all-powerful God. And then if you go back to the idea of nature, it's like, well, nature arose from God. He created nature, but he's also separate from nature. That nature is part of his grand design. And so then this is a God that necessarily then it acts in history. He is present in time, and he shapes history and time to his will. It's almost like too simple in a way, but it only feels that way because we've been living in it so long. But that was an absolutely radical, revolutionary idea. And when you think about it, then it makes sense that it has persisted. Because if God is in control of everything, then, like by definition, then anything that happens to you was part of God's plan. It almost seems kind of stupid, but like, you look at the results. I mean, so when they got conquered by the Assyrians, then they were like, "Wow, I wonder why God did that." It wasn't like, "Oh, that we probably got it wrong." They were just like, "Oh, God must have done that." There was something incredibly sticky and resilient about this idea. It like took hold of them. And no matter how much torture or slaughter or bloodshed or subjugation or lies or betrayals or, you know what I mean? Like, they held on to this view of reality. It really took hold of them. And it created all sorts of problems. I mean, there's tons of books in the Bible that are just sad. Like, they're suffering and they're wondering why God turned their face from them. And then because they saw the universe as inherently a moral place, they were wondering, did we do something wrong, right? Are we somehow evil or unworthy? And this identity persisted through all manner, right, of catastrophe. And look at the results. Like if you knew them back then, right, you'd say, man, that's a really dumb way to look at, like, you're like a little too simple to survive. But you look at it now, they laid the groundwork for all the, like the majority of the world's religions, right? The Christianity and Islam. And then they laid the foundation for all of Western civilization. I mean, all of this is possible because of them. And you think, man, it was just an idea. It was just a way of looking at the world, and somehow it just gripped their DNA or something, and there's nothing that you can do to them that will make them abandon this faith. And there's something to be said of that. So this is the context in which the Gospels came to be. And one thing that it really makes you think about is to think about all that the Jews went through, right? All that they suffered. As this tiny kingdom that collapsed in on itself and then was battered by massively more powerful, vast kingdoms. To survive all that, you couldn't torture it out of you. You couldn't beat it out. There's no amount of coercion to make them turn from their faith. And then along comes this rabbi named Jesus, right? And suddenly they're converting in droves. For some reason, they're not really abandoning their identity, but they're absolutely changing the nature of how they saw the universe. And it's just what made them do that. It's just a very fascinating story, and the Gospel of John tells part of that story, and the Gospel of John itself is very controversial. So we'll talk about some of that in the next video, but yeah, so welcome to this study, and I hope you find it illuminating, and I really, look, come at this from whatever perspective you like. I welcome anyone, atheistic, whatever, Jew, Muslim, I don't care. Hopefully you find this to be an engaging story, so there you go.